So Elon, are you tracking this new 3-eye Atlas thing at all? Like, are you watching that comet or whatever the hell it is?
I saw that. If something's pushing it besides gravity, that's unusual. Not exact proof of aliens, but it raises an eyebrow. The whole thing feels a little too interesting for just space rock. If it was a ship, it'd be insanely heavy, like continent killer heavy, but most likely it's just a rare asteroid.
When Joe Rogan leans forward and asks Elon Musk if he is paying attention to the object called 3-eye Atlas, the room goes quiet in a very specific way. It is the quiet that happens when a joke suddenly feels a little too real. Elon laughs and says that if you tried to build a spaceship out of almost pure nickel the way some people are talking about, it would be unbelievably heavy, like launching a chunk of Manhattan made of metal. But then he calmly explains that if something like that actually hit the Earth, it would not just crack a few windows, it would erase a continent. It might erase us. He reminds Joe of a promise he has made many times. If he ever finds real evidence of aliens, he will not keep it secret. He will walk back into that studio, sit down across from Joe, and tell the world on that show. The two of them talk about the fossil record, about the giant extinction events that wiped almost everything out and left only a thin layer of clues in stone, and about all the other impacts that were big enough to sterilize half a continent but small enough to vanish in the noise of hundreds of millions of years. In that conversation, 3-eye Atlas is almost a thought experiment, a way to talk about fragility and chance and the strange silence of the universe. But then, away from the studio, the sky actually delivers something that sounds like it was written by a nervous science fiction writer. On the 1st of July 2025, a robotic telescope in Chile called the Asteroid Terrestrial Impact Last Alert System picks up a faint moving dot about 4.5 times farther from the Sun than Earth is, roughly out near the orbit of Jupiter. At first, it looks like just another distant comet. Then, astronomers start to calculate its path and realize that its orbit is not an ellipse, not a closed loop held in place by the Sun, but a hyperbola, an open curve. It is moving so fast, around 61 kilometers per second relative to the Sun, that it is not gravitationally bound to our system at all. It came from interstellar space, and it will return to interstellar space. Only 2 such visitors have ever been seen before, the strange cigar-shaped object called Oumuamua in 2017 and the more ordinary comet Borisov in 2019. 3-eye Atlas is the third, which is where the name comes from. The 3-eye part marks it as the third interstellar object. Atlas comes from the telescope that found it. Elon hears that and jokes that it sounds like third eye, like some cosmic symbol aimed straight at us. But underneath the joke, you can hear that he understands exactly how weird this is. A block of rock and ice that may have formed billions of years before the Sun has been traveling through the dark between the stars. And at the exact moment in history when a species with podcasts, rockets, and particle colliders appears on a small blue planet, that block happens to cut straight through our backyard. Astronomers estimate that the solid core might be a few kilometers across, perhaps 10 or 11 in diameter if it reflects light the way a typical comet does, which is roughly comparable to the asteroid that ended the dinosaurs. If something that size hit Earth at interstellar speeds, the energy would be beyond anything our civilization has ever imagined. Elon is not exaggerating when he tells Joe that this kind of impact could kill most humans, possibly all of us. Not in some dramatic movie explosion, but with shockwaves, firestorms, and a long global winter that agriculture could not survive. The most basic question suddenly becomes, what exactly is this thing, and what is it doing here? From the very beginning, 3-eye Atlas refuses to act like a boring piece of ice. When powerful telescopes split its light into colors, they find an extremely odd fingerprint. Compared to most comets and asteroids we know, this object seems to have a very unusual ratio of iron to nickel, with some teams reporting an extreme abundance of nickel vapor in the gas surrounding it and hints of almost pure nickel in its tail. That is strange because on Earth, very nickel-rich material tends to show up in industrial alloys and in the buried scars of past impacts, where nickel-rich objects slammed into our planet and left behind metal deposits that mining companies now chase. Elon points this out to Joe, explaining that some of the nickel and cobalt we dig up today is literally the wreckage of long-dead comets and asteroids that hit a young Earth with unimaginable force. 3I Atlas also seems rich in water and carbon dioxide, but poor in some of the carbon chain molecules that are common in comets born in our own system. It glows with a color that shifts from dusty red to ghostly blue and even green as different gases light up under solar radiation. Its tail behaves strangely too. At times it seems to grow a faint structure pointing toward the sun instead of away from it, something astronomers call an anti-tail, which happens when the geometry of the dust trail and our line of sight line up just right. One research team announces that 3I Atlas might be 7 billion years old, older than our own solar system, which means it formed around a star that lit up, burned, and perhaps died long before our sun was even born. All of this would already make it one of the most important objects in the sky, a literal piece of someone else's planet, building material drifting through our neighborhood. But then Harvard astronomer Avi Loeb publishes a paper with 2 younger colleagues, not in a peer-reviewed journal, but on an open preprint server, asking a question that immediately sets the internet on fire. They look at the orbit and noticing how the plane of that orbit lies within a few degrees of the plane in which our planets circle the sun, the ecliptic plane, they calculate that the chance of such alignment happening by accident is around 0.2%. They point out that 3I Atlas passes relatively close to Venus, Mars, and Jupiter on its way through, and they sketch out a speculative scenario in which an advanced civilization might use a reverse slingshot around the sun, what they call a reverse solar maneuver, to break an object like this and leave it bound to our star. As a pedagogical exercise, as they themselves call it, they ask whether 3I Atlas could be artificial, maybe even possibly hostile technology, a probe built by something that subscribes to the dark forest idea. The idea that in a dangerous galaxy, the smartest move is to stay quiet and hit first. They do not claim to have proof. They do not announce that this comet really is a warship. But those 2 words, possibly hostile, escape the paper and begin a second, very different journey. Headlines scream that a Harvard professor thinks an alien spacecraft is entering the solar system. On the Joe Rogan show, Avi talks about how open we should be to unconventional explanations and how big mysteries deserve bold thinking, and Joe does exactly what he always does. He pushes on the weird parts, asks about hostile probes and hidden civilizations, laughs at the absurdity of it, and then circles right back to the question, but seriously, what if? Elon, for his part, shrugs off some of the wilder claims but admits that there is something deeply unsettling about how quiet the universe seems to be. He says he has never seen evidence of aliens, no secret ruins on Mars, no crashed craft hidden in warehouses, and that in some ways this silence worries him more than a clear answer would. If we are alone, that means that every interstellar rock that screams past us without warning is a reminder of how thin our margin for survival really is. The way the 3I Atlas story unfolds after that feels like a stress test for our entire information system. As the comet races inward, passing the orbit of Mars at almost 60 kilometers per second, the United States government shuts down over a budget fight, and at the precise moment when one of our best cameras is scheduled to take high-resolution pictures of this object, the people who normally process and release those images are either furloughed or working under intense restrictions. The high-resolution imaging science experiment on the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter takes pictures when 3I Atlas passes about 29 million kilometers from Mars at the start of October, but days turn into weeks, and those images do not appear. European spacecraft release their own lower resolution shots, grainy smears of light that show a stretched out glow and a hint of structure, and ground-based telescopes in Chile and Hawaii keep feeding the community raw frames where the comet looks like a tilted spindle with a faint tail. Meanwhile, Avi goes on television and says very calmly that there is no reason the data could not be processed by the university team running the camera and shared with scientists, even if the United States Space Agency is stuck in paperwork. He points out that there are already several unexplained anomalies in the chemical and dynamical data. Journalists seize on every phrase. Influencers and conspiracy channels on social media leap from possibly hostile in an academic paper to definitely hostile in their thumbnails. And within a few weeks, millions of people are convinced that 3I Atlas is changing course under its own power, slowing down, speeding up, or pulsing with coded radio signals. NASA and the European Space Agency put out careful statements explaining that the object is on a hyperbolic trajectory that will carry it back out of the solar system after it passes closest to the Sun at the end of October, never coming nearer to Earth than roughly 1.8 times the distance from Earth to the Sun, which means it poses no impact danger at all. They remind the public that when icy bodies warm up, jets of gas and dust can act like tiny rocket engines, adding non-gravitational forces that slightly nudge the path and mimic course changes, and that we have seen this over and over with comets inside our own solar system. Radio astronomers using the Meerkat Array in South Africa finally announced that they have detected a radio signal from 3I Atlas, and the phrase alone sounds like contact, but the details tell a more ordinary story. The frequencies match exactly what is expected when ultraviolet sunlight breaks apart water molecules that have been blasted off a comet's surface, leaving behind fragments called hydroxyl radicals that absorb and emit radio waves at very specific frequencies around 1,665 and 1,667 megahertz. In other words, it is water, not Wi-Fi. Hubble and the James Webb Space Telescope add optical and infrared observations that show a growing coma of gas and a tail that behaves like dust pushed by the solar wind and sunlight, not like exhaust from a giant engine. The brightness flares, the strange color, the weird iron and nickel balance, all of it can be explained, at least in principle, by a combination of unusual chemistry and an extreme age in an environment very different from the cloud of material that birthed our own system. By the time NASA finally announces that it will release the long-awaited high-resolution images, even tabloid newspapers are admitting that the object is still intact, still following the predicted path, and still looks very much like a complicated, dusty, natural comet. Yet the power of this story has very little to do with whether 3I Atlas is an alien spacecraft or a strange chunk of frozen debris. The power lies in what it forces us to look at. For months, a needle of ice and metal that was born around another star has been threading its way through our system at extraordinary speed, and we are watching it with cameras that did not exist a generation ago. Telescopes that can pick up the faint whisper of hydroxyl radicals breaking apart, and software that can rewind its path through space and trace it back toward a thick disk of stars far from our own. Joe and Elon sit in a room and talk about it because it is exactly the kind of story their whole relationship with the audience is built on. Joe is the stand-in for everyone listening who looks up at the night sky and feels both awe and dread. Elon is the engineer who spends his life trying to ensure that if a rock like this ever does line up with Earth, we are not helpless passengers. When he talks about building cities on Mars, about turning humanity into a multi-planetary species, it sounds grandiose until you remember that the planet has been hit again and again by 3I Atlas-sized objects, and that we only notice the few that left scars large enough and recent enough to still show up in rocks we can dig. When Avi argues that we should not rule out wild possibilities just because they are uncomfortable, he is not trying to sell fear. He is trying to remind the scientific community that the universe has surprised us over and over, from the first exoplanets that did not fit any neat category to the first interstellar object that tumbled past like a broken monolith. 3I Atlas is, in the end, almost certainly a natural comet, but that does not make it less dramatic. It is a physical message in a bottle. A piece of someone else's failed planet or failed moon, soaked in radiation for billions of years and then flung into the darkness until gravity and chance steered it here. It carries water, carbon dioxide, and metals that we recognize, yet in proportions and states that challenge our models and force us to rewrite pieces of our textbooks. It has provoked arguments in universities, urgent meetings at space agencies, headlines that mix truth and fantasy, and late-night conversations between comedians, billionaires, and scientists about whether we are alone in a galaxy that clearly does not care what we believe.